Hi there, welcome back. This week we're diving into one of the most consequential aspects of archival work, appraisal for selection and acquisition. We're going to explore how archivists make decisions about how long we should keep records and which of these should be preserved for future consultation. Let's start first with this concept, appraisal. You might be familiar with the concept of appraisal as a professional assessment of an item or property's value, quality, or condition. We appraise real estate for mortgages or insurance, for example. In the workplace, we might perform an appraisal of a job performance. In archival science, appraisal is the process of determining whether records have long-term value beyond their immediate use or primary value, and identifying those that should be kept as part of an archives. It's not just about identifying important information, it's about understanding context, relationships, and ongoing significance. Appraisal requires archivists to ask important questions. What evidence does this record provide? Who created it and why? How does it fit into or challenge broader social, political, or cultural narratives? Who might need access to it in the future? The goal of archival appraisal is to build collections that best document people, institutions, communities, experiences, events, and activities while managing limited resources. We can't keep everything. And appraisal is the method that we use to decide what to keep, what to discard, and how long certain records should be retained. This core function determines what becomes a permanent archive, shaping everything from acquisition to access, and involves complex judgments about relevance, reliability, and potential future use. While guided by professional ethics, institutional guidelines, and cultural practices, appraisal is also a reflection of our professional expertise and, in some cases, our personal interests. Historically, appraisal relied heavily on Schellenberg's ideas about primary and secondary value. Schellenberg defines primary value as the record's usefulness to its original creator. For example, we create records for administrative, legal, or fiscal reasons. Secondary value is the record's usefulness to others, for example, to researchers or other agencies. In North America, we often think of records managers as having interest in managing records for their primary value, and archivists as concerned with secondary value, although there is obviously some overlap. Schellenberg further divided secondary value into evidential and informational. Evidential value refers to the importance of records in documenting the Evidential value refers to the importance of records in documenting the functions, policies, and activities or decisions that an organization or person makes. It's less about the subject matter of the records and more about establishing proof of how an organization or person or family operated, its functions, and activities. Records with high evidential value might include meeting minutes from a corporation's board, office manuals, strategic planning documents, and policy correspondence. Informational value refers to the potential use of the information created within the records for the purposes other than documenting the creator's own functions or activities. This value applies to information that is useful as a resource for wider social and historical research, such as data about the actions or events that took place and the people and organizations involved. Schellenberg recommended that archivists evaluate or appraise the informational value of records based on three criteria. One, uniqueness. Is the information found elsewhere? If the information is duplicated in other sources, it may be less valuable for preservation. Two, form. Is the information usable, meaningful, and easily accessible? Three, importance. How significant is the information to the needs of the government, historians, social scientists, or the general public? In summary, evidential value refers to records that document an organization's functions, and informational value means records that contain reusable information. To be clear, The distinction between the two is a conceptual tool for appraisal, but the values are not mutually exclusive, as a single record can possess both. Evidential value is an objective assessment tied to the creator's provenance and functions, while informational value tends to be more subjective, tied to the potential research use of the content itself. Assessing both evidential and informational value helps archivists decide which records might be useful to preserve in an archives, and it distinguishes them from their primary value, the value that they have for their original creators. Now, Schellenberg's appraisal methods work reasonably well for structured, bureaucratic systems. But modern record keeping and archival contexts are far more complicated and nuanced than the government of the 1950s. Traditional appraisal also tends to overlook marginalized voices and non-traditional record-keeping practices, such as oral traditions. Today, we are not only assessing records based on their evidential and informational value, but also their cultural significance, and we consider other factors, such as their authenticity, the completeness of a record or a related group of records, their usability, and let's be real, the cost of preservation. If you learn one thing from this week's lesson, it's that we can't keep everything, nor should we. Of course, archival theory and practice isn't static either. Our methods do evolve over time to meet changing social and technological environments. So while Schellenberg's work continues to influence the archival profession, I want you to consider some developments in appraisal that have emerged over the past few decades. Consider the proliferation of certain technologies of the latter half of the 20th century in the form of electric typewriters, personal computers, and printing technology. This has had a profound impact on record-keeping practices. By the 1980s, organizations were faced with an existential and economic crisis in the form of ballooning volumes of records and limited resources to manage them. This trend continues today, driven by digital technologies. Just think of how many photos you take in a week using your mobile device. Do you actively manage these images based on their informational or evidential value? Likely not. And if you're like me, you probably just move more and more of them to the cloud, which makes it more difficult to find what you're looking for and ramps up storage costs. The glut of records and the increasing diversity of records formats has reinforced the need for sound appraisal methods and prompted the archival profession to rethink the focus of our efforts altogether. In the 1990s, Canadian archivist Terry Cook introduced a method called macro appraisal, developed during his years working with a large public archives and dealing with a rapidly changing public administration. Macro appraisal shifts the focus of appraisal from the content of individual records, from the micro, to the functions and activities of records creators, the macro. This allows archivists to prioritize documenting what organizations do rather than merely what they produce. It also positions archivists as proactive agents in record-keeping practices. Cook encouraged archivists to work closely with records managers to analyze an organization's functions and activities, identifying their legal, fiscal, and business requirements, which in turn would suggest the types of records that they need to create and keep, and for how long. This form of appraisal not only supports record keeping for primary value, but also the archivists to select records with secondary value to be transferred to archival custody once they are no longer useful to the creating body. The macro appraisal method is now used in many public archives and large organizations around the world and is considered the Canadian standard in archival science. So far, we've been talking about appraisal in a custodial context, where records of an organization are eventually transferred to an archives, that is, an extension of the same organization. Government records are transferred to a government or public archives. Business records are transferred to that business's corporate archives. Church records are sent to the church archives, and so on. In a custodial context, the transition from records creators to archivists is an administrative process. But not all archives are what we might call custodial. where the creating body is the institutional home of the archives. Many are non-custodial, meaning that these archives acquire records from a third party or a donor. These types of collecting institutions include special collections libraries, public history rooms, or historical societies and community archives. Non-custodial contexts present additional challenges when considering how to identify and evaluate records for potential inclusion in an archival program. There's no law or policy or cultural norm that would naturally trigger a creator to give their records to an archives, which means that building relationships with records creators, whether this is, again, a person, family, organization, or business, is an important part of a collections building process. And it might be considered part of the appraisal process. Let's look at two appraisal methodologies that assume non-custodial contexts. The first, non-custodial methodology, emerges out of special collections libraries. These are archives that hold unique archival collections from multiple provenance and are intended to support teaching and research, typically within a university or a college. In the mid-1980s, American archivist Helen Samuels proposed a method she called documentation strategy to address her growing concern that archivists were not doing enough to build collections that represented the achievements of women in science. This was a gap across all collecting institutions that she wanted to address with more strategic appraisal methodology, and so she set out to build relationships with potential donors, identifying collections with great research value, and ensuring that these would eventually come into an archives where they could be preserved for future generations. Samuel's documentation strategy also acknowledges an archival imperative to build interesting collections that can broadly represent the culture we experience. She noted that some people and communities were overrepresented in research collections, reflecting many of the same biases that exist in our social, economic, and political environments, and that others were left out completely. The goal of documentation strategy is to first identify those gaps in a collection, and then second, develop practices to fill those gaps. For example, archivists can establish principles to guide the appraisal or acquisition of records that document specific geographic areas, communities, subjects, processes, or events that have impacted society. As a methodology, documentation strategy might also involve efforts to build relationships with marginalized groups with the intention of one day acquiring their records as part of a collections development activity. More recently, archival scholars like Michelle Caswell and Andrew Flynn have pointed out that marginalized communities already participate in their own record-keeping activities. Some may be interested in having their archives preserved as part of a traditional archives, but others may actively resist this kind of institutionalization. While we don't have enough time to dig into community archives fully in this course, I do want to draw your attention to a second non-custodial methodology that emerges from a community archives perspective, and that's participatory archiving. As a community-led practice, participatory archiving involves community members in creating, shaping, and caring for records in ways that honor their shared values, perspectives, and needs. This practice challenges traditional archival appraisal because it requires archivists to defer to community expertise to determine what is meaningful and deserving of preservation. The goal is to rebuild trust between archivists and marginalized communities by addressing historical harms and power imbalances embedded in traditional archival practices. Archivists may end up acquiring collections as part of participatory archiving, or they may use this methodology to support community-based record keeping with no expectation other than ensuring that records of enduring value are safely kept for as long as they are needed. Appraisal is not just a technical process, it is political and relational. I would be remiss if I did not raise the issue of appraisal in born digital contexts. I think it goes without saying that digital records complicate everything. We now deal with enormous volume, ephemeral formats, embedded metadata, cloud storage, and platform dependencies. Archivists must evaluate not only the evidential and informational value of records, but also the feasibility of long-term preservation. For digital materials, appraisal may involve an assessment of file formats, technical dependencies, risks, and required preservation actions. It is my opinion that appraisal should not happen in a vacuum. We need to understand the resources we need to preserve and make accessible records, and we need to balance cost and benefit. If we can't care for the records we take in, we need to ask ourselves why we are taking them in. Now, some might say that our leadership and expertise in appraisal is what separates archivists from collectors. Consider that every appraisal decision opens and closes possibilities. When we choose what to preserve, we also choose what is potentially forgotten. Ethical appraisal requires transparency, reflexivity, and engagement with diverse perspectives. This week's assignment asks you to practice writing an appraisal justification or rationale. Approach it not as a test, but as an opportunity to articulate your emerging professional judgment. And I'll see you next week for arrangement and description.